Okay, hi everyone. I'm almost apprehensive now about this talk after seeing the quality of the first 5 presentations. It feels like you all are the experts of storytelling already. So my talk is more about framing it, right? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we are rethinking in terms of narratives, where do we place that when we think of science communication, and where are we in this moment that we're making sense of, right? So I think we've come across this graph today in many different ways, but just to kind of point to the starting point of where we are, which is hovering on the 1.5 degrees, and also a kind of recognition of how little time we have left. So how does that, with the time that we're in, how does that influence our stories? Is there an urgency about the way we as storytellers talk about it? Or you as storytellers want other people to make sense of that time as well? So the context of the time looks like a large geological time context, but also what does that kind of hockey stick mean for India, right? And we have seen the different kinds of headlines now, which I think some of the presenters as well pointed to, where we see that there's unprecedented warming, we see there are warnings coming from scientists. None of this is really new to us. And yet when we contextualize it, we see, again, if we think of the hockey stick, here is where we are at 1.5, where we already see the first rumblings of a planet that is losing balance. And as somebody before me in the jury as well said, this is just the beginning, this is the preview, right? This is the beginning of something that is to come. So how do we make sense of these stories in this time that we're in? And what is this time that we're in? Just to go a little bit back to the basics, why do we communicate science? Who benefits from communicating science? And how do we communicate science, right? So why it matters, obviously, public understanding, building up the kind of shared understanding of science and technology. It helps making the kind of expertise that you see also in this room, making it available to different people. It shapes policies, it supports risk assessment. Scientists are partners of the government in many ways. They are the ones that allow us to figure out our boundaries and parameters of what we can do and what is possible. And obviously innovation, as other people have mentioned, one of the mainstays of our civilizational growth or how we understand innovation, that too is something that science drives. Who benefits is all of us. The general public benefits, decision makers benefit, society benefit, and science itself benefits, because science is a self-learning mechanism. We are learning in order to put back so that we learn more. And these are the different kinds of ways that we communicate in halls like this, through policy briefs, through academic papers. But what science doesn't do yet very well is tell really stories about why science is talking about things a certain way. Why are visions shaped by science in a certain way as well? Now, if we contextualize climate communication and climate storytelling in a larger kind of evolution of communication, we see that it is actually not very, very old. Even though the environmental problem or global warming, we've now known about it for 200 years in whatever format, but the environmental crisis both abroad and in India really started becoming a story in the 1970s, where you see the first fallouts of degradation and you see the first kind of communities that are reacting to that degradation. The degradation, by the way, that is linked to scientific revolutions, that is linked to the Industrial Revolution, that is linked to industrial growth as well. So in 1970s, you see the first kind of emergence of the importance of environmental issues and flagging the fact that things are not going according to plan. In 1988, with the IPCC, you find a collective of people finally talking about climate change together. So you build up basically a community who starts scientifically talking about what is going wrong with the climate crisis. Through through the 1980s and through the 1990s, you see a sudden kind of big shift in media coverage on climate crisis. You see the first report that comes out, and that leads to a lot of public discourse. But if you reflect on where the public discourse happens, who is talking about climate crisis, it is still very much in the 1990s in closed doors and expertise. And this is something I anyway want to flag because a lot of you came up here today and said, I'm not an expert on climate. You don't need to be an expert on climate. We are living it. And nobody is an expert on climate because we don't know what's coming. So the figuring out of communities together of what we mean by how we're going to deal with climate is something that we are doing by storytelling in this room today. And that's why it's so important. 2000s, you start seeing the first kind of mass movements around advocacy, activism in this area. And inconvenient truth, I think many of you might have encountered it, that comes as a very big kind of viral kind of idea, right? 2010, you see social media coming into place, so there's a lot of discourse suddenly, which is public discourse. So you see science slowly moving away from the closed doors and getting into people talking about it and also narrativizing that problem. And you also see, which continues today, a very big surge of science communicators, of scientists who kind of leave their closed doors and they take to public engagement, they take to the streets, and they say this is a problem for all of us. We cannot kind of emphasize enough that we are not being able to communicate to you how big a problem this is. Which is what brings us here, where all of these different lineages are kind of coming together, right? The science is coming together, public engagement is coming together, and so are all of this public opinion and public engagement. And it is super important it comes together because, as many of our esteemed jury members and Go Green Club members all said, we do not have much time. We actually have a very, very short window of time before things become irreversible. So the sense of urgency can only be coming from communication, because ultimately stories are what moves us, as you yourselves have said in the last couple of presentations. And what kind of stories we tell is going to be very, very important. Okay, why hasn't science communication worked? Right? Why are we moving into this narrativizing of science? So one is obviously audiences, right? Who do scientists actually talk to? They don't talk to everybody. They talk to specific kinds of people. And they also use a specific kind of language, which also builds to the idea of expertise in science, right? But all of these are things that can be moved, shifted, dismantled when we think about how we can really think about bringing science in more into the mainstream. What are the reasons that scientists communicate? It might be in many different ways, but often it would not be in very big social arenas, right? You have different voices, different communication styles, different ways of speaking, different ways of writing. So engagement is also something that is an art, right? Figuring out what will make people listen is also something that storytellers have to do. They're not born with that skill. So storytelling, when you think of science and storytelling in general, is as much of a skill as science is, or as much of a art as science is sometimes as well. The other reason is that scientists do science in their ivory towers, right? And those are then kind of interpreted and distributed as ideas into society. So this kind of intermediary, the way that communication is actually spread, also has a big bearing on how effective science is to communicate. Additional challenges, of course, are isolation of scientists. Science is an isolating kind of discipline. You work alone for a long period of time. You do research alone often, and you are kind of in your own echo chamber as scientists many times. There is also criticism, especially when science talks to power. It is very, very difficult for scientists to kind of be heard in the way that they need to be, or be legitimized in terms of how the response to them is actually. There's also a disconnect between scientists and public administrators. So the people who do science and the way that things are administered are often not actually connected to each other. Obviously, there are censorship, there's political restrictions, there are restrictions of other kinds like wars, floods, natural disasters. There are lots of restrictions to the way and where scientists can speak. And the last, I would say, are silos, that scientists are really still very much stuck in silos of thinking, because also we are trained in certain ways of thinking about the world. And it is very hard to break those silos for us. So the kind of ask to everyone is to see the world and the earth system as an integrated system. That if I'm talking about metallurgy, for example, that we also think about the ecology that is in. We also think about the community that is connected to that space. That we think about the place that we're in. And my kind of urge to everyone is not just think about it from a human-centric point, but that we actually share that space with multi-species. We share it with all other kinds of beings, from fungal to trees to birds. That should also be part of the logic of what we're thinking about in terms of resilience or restoration. Okay, so how is narrative making then different from science communication? Science, I think, as some of our young presenters also said, is more about facts, data, and evidence. Narratives bring in stories, emotions, values, identities into that piece as well. If science explains what is happening and how we know things, narratives tell us why it matters. What is the meaning of that thing that is happening? How do we connect to that thing that is happening? If science use charts, reports, and media coverage, then stories use metaphors, lived experience, poetry, and different ways of making connection to another person through stories. So this is a false dichotomy. There is no science communication versus narrative making. It is about what we can do together with those two skill sets, right? So I would never tell somebody, don't be a scientist and only be a storyteller. But I would say, think about the elements of storytelling when you're talking about science, right? You are not just a scientist. You also have the responsibility to be a storyteller, because you are the one who knows the story of that arena that you're working in. Okay, now, I think all of you will be familiar with these kind of narratives that we constantly encounter as to why we cannot work on climate change, right? Why climate inaction? So the first is someone else should take responsibility. So we often do that with our political kind of agency. If you talk about India's position in the global stage, one of the positions it will take is common differentiated responsibilities, right? Which says, hey, you have to do something first. Why should we've been the ones who's been kind of taken advantage of for centuries and centuries. So we shouldn't be the first movers on this. Or the second, it's too late. It's not possible to do anything. We don't have time. Everything is shit. So why bother? We just have to kind of accept that what's going to come, we'll have to adapt to. And we probably will not adapt. But we try not to think that far, because surrender tells us that we can be apathetic and something will take care of us. Or not, but we'll figure it out. Third, change will be disruptive. If I do a decarbonized society, then I have to shift the way I consume, I have to shift the way I live, I have to shift the way I travel, I have to shift the way I eat. These are very, very big asks of someone. And that is true. Systemically, the way, the trajectory that we are on is incompatible with where we want to go, which means a fundamental shift as to what we want to do. How do we bring people on board to shift out of that? So something you'll often hear is that it's too difficult, it's too hard. How can policy tackle such a big problem? You can't shift a society in one generation, and we don't have a generation. We have 5 to 25 years, right? And the last is that shift things, but don't be disruptive. Let's not think about systemic change. Let's not think about overhauling the system. You've been given a little bit of space in the system, work within that space. Don't think about disrupting something bigger. So these are very, very familiar stories I'm sure all of you have encountered them in some form or the other. We have grappled with them as individuals as well, saying it's too difficult to do this. I don't want to do this. Anyway, nothing's going to change. Anyway, the systems are all screwed up. So what is the point of doing this? So not to say that you have to change the story right now, because those are very, very difficult transformations. Nobody comes into a story that they have lived and says, now I'm able to change everything. But rather what you're thinking about is, how do I identify these stories? How am I reacting to these stories? Can I figure out that this is a story and it's not reality? So what we're really asking you to do is make the distinction between, are these actually real problems? Or are there stories that we collectively have told ourselves as a society and we've bought into them so strongly that they feel like they are realities, right? So the first part is just to identify, is this a story or is this a reality, right? And science is super useful in doing that actually, of figuring out what is a reality and what is the fact base that you can then develop your story on. So where we are right now is in a very, very big tension of narratives. And this is only a snapshot of some of the narratives. This is pulled out of a paper on business innovation, right? So this is in the context of business. You can find these battle of narratives in many, many different arenas as well. So you can actually do an exercise of just collecting the kind of narratives that you are seeing in tension with each other in this amazing time that we're living in, right? Because it is as big as a fight between Ravan and Ram in some ways, right? Of a big kind of cosmic battle that we are all part of just by being born into this time. So the current narrative, profit comes first, everything else is second, right? What is the battle with? That sustainability comes first, that environment comes first, and everything else is second to that. Your growth is second to that, your economy is second to that, your money is second to that. Overconsumption is not a problem, but it's an integral part of how I build a business model. As Dr. Solanki also said, it is a problem, it has serious consequences, and that is the first step to thinking about what kind of resources we are using and degrading. Third, degrowth is not a viable option. We can't think of a life or society that is not focused on constant growth, of infinite growth. But in fact, it is a viable path to a socially just kind of society. It's a viable way to start thinking about what our societies could look like if growth wasn't at the center of it, right? And politically, there are lots of questions about degrowth. It comes from a particular kind of group in Europe. So people say that there are many kind of like the way to adapt it to an Indian context might be difficult, but I'm just using it as a kind of shorthand to say a particular way of thinking about growth, right? You don't necessarily have to subscribe to degrowth as the concept, but at the heart of degrowth is the idea that growth is not at the center of our concepts either. Fourth, climate change is an imminent risk for the future of humanity on this planet. But it's not an imminent risk. We are actually in it. So it is not something we are waiting for. We should be reacting, like Professor Solanki also said, like it's an emergency. And I think what Greta Thunberg said, right? Act like your house is on fire, because it is. A critical climate action, net zero goals, is what policy has kind of stuck with, is let's go for net zero by 2070, let's go by decarbonization by 2050. But what is going to survive that is the question, right? Net zero on basis of what? If you have no soil, you have major water shortages, you have droughts, you are going to be net zero anyway. Like, you don't have to try. So here is the question. What we're doing now is fighting predatory delay. And that means you have to take on very, very strong actors in the system. It's not only unfortunately about individuals, it also means that you have to collectivize and take on the handful of people in decision-making powers, the handful of people where wealth is concentrated. Because climate, I guess, fighting for climate action is also a very, very political act. And I think that is something that you have to get comfortable with knowing. It is not only about reusing bottles and planting trees, which are super important and things you should do within the ambit of what you can in a place-based kind of way of thinking about it, but it's also about who you become as political actors. How do you think about environment collectively? Who are you including and who are you excluding? And you all will be the leaders of thinking about that because you are thinking about it earlier than other people are. So this is this is a setup by an activist called Johanna Macy. I don't know if you all have heard about her. She's an environmentalist and a deep ecologist. She recently died as well. So she kind of has set up this idea of the fact that we are in a great churning or the great unraveling. And we are at a very, very crucial point in human evolution where the stories we live by are pretty much business as usual, right? Like growth is essential, nature is a commodity, promoting consumption is good for the economy, so you can't touch that. The central idea is getting ahead, not working together, individualism rather than collaboration. And that other people's problems, other species' problems, they are not our problem. Our problem is our own worldview and way of forging ahead in the world, right? And yet where we are right now with these stories is that we are in an economic decline, we are in a resource depletion, we are undergoing climate change, we also are living through unprecedented kind of wars in the world, maybe not in number, but certainly in tragedy. And we are living through the 6th extinction of species as well, at a highly accelerated rate. So then what do we do in this position that we're in? And there are different ways to go. I think one of the presentations really nicely pointed it out as well, is that you can choose the stories of despair, because those are all there, right? We can keep talking about all of this that we are living through and we know. But we also have stories about who we want to be in this time. And what we set out in this time is what the trajectory that we're shaping for the future is. And those stories is thinking about, I mean, the way that she has set it out is in these 3 dimensions, right? Where you hold actions, you slow down, you protect things, you raise awareness, you gather evidence, you understand the problem. You don't start with saying, I want to change the world. You start with saying, do I understand what is happening to me? Do I understand the systems I'm embedded in? Do I understand where those systems come from, where they are going? And that is your first, just holding that space, right? The second is really thinking about new ways of figuring out new systems. As you understand more in a system, you understand the cracks and opportunities as well. So where can you place the way you think about remaking a system then? So you open that out and you say, okay, where can I place this and where are the opportunities for new ways of thinking about these structures? And the last, I mean the highest level would be actually your shift in consciousness, because then you get more integrated with your world, you understand your system, and you've been able to do the emotional work of holding that space as well. Now, storytelling is emotional work because you are using emotions to connect with other people. So it is important that you also learn how to hold your own emotions in a way, right, to communicate it effectively. So, lastly, what are the ways then that you would engage? I'm happy to share these slides with you. The citations are all in the notes section, so you all can go and check them out. So these are just 3 different kinds of ideas that people have said. One is, of course, communicating, where you feel something, you share it, and your sharing makes other people feel less alone, they feel more empowered. So through communication is how you are building a community. The second is creating new structures and models, creating and understanding what is possible and what is not possible, what you can do and what you can't do. There are things you can't do, and that's okay. And of course, the dismantling, the real political act of remaking the world in the vision that you want, right? And the last is being. right? Like just how do I cultivate environmental mindfulness? How do I build optimistic narratives even though I may be feeling pessimism in this time? How do I do lifestyle changes that affect me but also affect other beings around me? How do I strengthen social connections? And these two help you do that as well. And of course, the last would be, I mean, not last, I would say the first or the continuous kind of thing is also to build psychological resilience in the face of this. Because your work of storytelling, of communicating, will also kind of depend on your own resilience in the face of what is coming. We are all going through something together, and our stories will either make it easier for us to go through it or more difficult. So I guess the question is, which stories are you going to choose, and who are you going to be in this crisis that's coming? Thanks.